Before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. No recording of this webinar, this presentation, and the corresponding slides are copyrighted by Robson Forensic and may not be recorded, copied, distributed, or otherwise used without authorization. Today's presentation is on illicit drugs and as they relate to toxicology cases. Our presenter today is Dr. Madeleine Swortwood. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can submit them via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window, or you can email them directly to us at inquiries@robsonforensic.com. If your question is clearly case related, we're not going to answer that on camera. We'll want to run a conflict check and talk to you about that offline. With that, Dr. Swortwood, please take it away.
Thank you, Anne. So like Anne said, my name is Dr. Madeleine Swortwood, and I'm a toxicologist here with Robson Forensic. I have an extensive background in toxicology and analytical chemistry with a focus on drugs of abuse. I have a bachelor's degree in biochemistry and a PhD in chemistry from Florida International University. Prior to joining Robson, I spent time working in various areas of toxicology, including roles in academia and local and federal government labs. I previously worked as a forensic toxicologist for the Miami-Dade County Medical Examiner, where I worked in postmortem toxicology, and I was a licensed blood alcohol analyst. There, I performed routine analysis of drugs, alcohols, and poisons for different types of fatalities. I also studied counterfeit pharmaceuticals in a variety of different research projects at the FDA Forensic Chemistry Center. And for my postdoctoral research fellowship with the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, I was a co-investigator on a controlled cannabis administration study. Having such a diverse background gives me a distinct advantage in my approach to forensic casework. As a forensic expert at Robson Forensic, my investigations focus on drug and/or alcohol impairment in cases involving personal injury, motor vehicle crashes, and workplace injuries, among others. I also investigate and interpret drug test results for court-ordered toxicology tests, such as hair testing in child custody cases. The toxicologists here at Robson Forensic are well qualified to assist you with a variety of toxicology-related cases. Today, we'll be specifically discussing drugs of abuse like cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine, and fentanyl. So you may be wondering where we can assist you. And as forensic toxicologists, we follow standard practice for our field. In this case, we have a document that helps us, which would be the best practice recommendation for guidelines of opinions and testimony in forensic toxicology. So what can we do? We can help interpret toxicology reports. We can qualify if a drug concentration is in the therapeutic, toxic, or fatal range within the context of a case. We can also address the pharmacology and the impairing effects of a substance within the fact pattern of that case. Many of you are probably very familiar with the calculations we can provide for alcohol as well. Some things that toxicologists should not do include determining the absolute cause of death, opining on impairment based solely on a quantitative drug result, inferring impairment from urine or hair, performing retrograde calculations for drugs other than alcohol, or determining the effects of a drug on an individual without considering other facts in the case. Some of the materials that we find helpful in our analyses, depending on the type of case that we're investigating, could be medical reports, police reports, crash reports, videos, toxicology reports, autopsy reports if there's a fatality, prescription records, and deposition testimony. So let's dive into some of the cases where a toxicologist like myself might be helpful for interpreting drug findings, including an example from personal injury, custody, and workplace. So different types of cases might actually be associated with different types of toxicology samples or specimens. For example, a personal injury case might involve blood. This might be collected either with a warrant by the police, or it might be at the hospital, in which case it would be serum. Sometimes drug testing in a hospital can also be performed in urine instead of blood. Custody might involve urine or hair for both the parent and or the minor. And workplace might involve urine or postmortem blood if there's a death. What's important to consider, though, is that each of these types of specimens give us a different timeline or window of detection. In general, blood gives us an idea of what was in the body in the last few hours. Urine gives us an idea of what was in the body in the last few days, and hair gives us an idea of drug use over the past few weeks or months, depending on the length of that hair sample. With that being said, we cannot directly tie a urine test or a hair test to recent drug use or impairment without considering additional case information. So what are we looking for when we do our analysis? Different drug types actually produce different changes to the body, and those might affect driving in different ways. Vital signs, absent of major injuries, can help us understand if someone is on a stimulant like cocaine or a depressant like heroin. Driving behavior like lane weaving or excessive speeding can also be indicators of certain drug types. And best of all, the eyes don't lie. Pupil size, reaction to light, and nystagmus can be indicative of different drug categories as well. So to illustrate this point, the dilated pupils that you see on the left are consistent with a stimulant like methamphetamine or even a hallucinogen like LSD. On the right, this would be a classic demonstration of pinpoint pupils. That would be consistent with a narcotic analgesic like heroin, fentanyl, or oxy. So I know this is a busy slide, but I promise I'll walk you guys through it. So we can actually categorize different drugs based on some of these signs and symptoms that we see. So here we have what's called the DRE matrix. DRE stands for Drug Recognition Expert. These are law enforcement officers that are trained in recognizing drug impairment. And this is a great resource that helps us as toxicologists understand what might be documented in a police report, written in a medical report, or even seen on body cam footage. So using this tool, we can separate drugs into 7 different categories. And I'm going to go from left to right. So we've got CNS depressants. CNS stands for central nervous system. So depressants would be downers. This would be something like Xanax. Then we've got CNS stimulants. This would be uppers like meth or cocaine. Next, we've got hallucinogens like LSD. Next would be dissociative anesthetics. The most classic example of this would be PCP. Then we've got narcotic analgesics like fentanyl, heroin, oxy. Next would be inhalants. That's anything that people would be huffing. And last, we have cannabis. You might be wondering why cannabis or marijuana gets its own category. And that would be because the effects of marijuana are unique. So they've got some overlap with depressants and hallucinogens, and because of this, they actually just get its own category. So as you can see here, we start to see how different drug categories might affect the eyes, like we just discussed, or vital signs, and even muscle tone. And all of these are involuntary changes in the body, and they're observable to trained DRE officers as well as toxicologists. So going down the column on the left-hand side from top to bottom, I'm going to go through the different things that a DRE might record for their examination. So we've got horizontal gaze nystagmus and vertical gaze nystagmus. So nystagmus is actually an involuntary jerking of the eyes. Next, we have lack of convergence. This means losing the ability to converge your eyes or the ability to cross your eyes, followed by pupil size and pupil reaction to light. Then for our vital signs, we have heart rate or pulse, blood pressure, and body temperature. And then last but not least, we have muscle tone. So I thought I would share with you some of the different types of drug trends that I'm seeing in different casework. So first off would be fentanyl. Opioid trends have certainly been changing over the last decade or so, especially in the realm of heroin use. A few years ago, I would see fentanyl cut into heroin. Now there's cases of just fentanyl or even fentanyl analogs, and actually no markers of actual heroin use. There's also tablets on the street that contain fentanyl as well, so people are taking it orally and not just injecting it. Next, we have marijuana, which honestly is probably not surprising given the medicalization and recreational use that's allowed in many of our states. There's also a lot of cases where alcohol is used with drugs, like cocaine or methamphetamine, and the users themselves actually think that a stimulant will mask their alcohol impairment, but that's not the case. So for these types of scenarios, we can actually see the effects of both the alcohol and the drug at the same time, since they don't actually cancel each other out. And lastly, drug combinations. These are challenging and require very thorough investigations, and we need to consider things like additive effects, where something like 2 + 2 = 4, or sometimes when you have a combination, you're going to have synergistic effects. Synergistic would be like if 2 + 2 = 6. And some drugs, when they're combined with other drugs from the same category, particularly CNS depressants, will produce greater effects when they are taken together, and this can be especially dangerous. So we know that most states have a 0.08 per se limit for alcohol in adult drivers. What we don't have is a 0.08 equivalent for each drug. So some states might have zero tolerance laws as it comes to drugs and driving. Some might have per se limits. Others might require demonstration of impairment. And it's important to understand that regardless of what state you're in, there are no per se limits for drugs that are widely accepted in the scientific community. So going back to the beginning of the presentation where I discussed what toxicologists can opine on, remember, a drug level needs to be considered within the context of a case. So simply having a number or a level of a drug is not going to be sufficient for us to opine on. Just like alcohol, drugs impair driving. Drivers under the effects of drugs can have erratic steering or braking, slowed reaction time, poor decision-making, increased risk-taking, inattention, inability to avoid hazards like walls or other cars or pedestrians, difficulty maintaining their lane or distance, unable to divide their attention, slow glare recovery, and decreased visual acuity. So let's walk through a couple of different types of case examples. So we'll start here with a personal injury example. So here we have a plaintiff who was driving and struck head-on by defendant. Both of them were transported to the hospital for their injuries. The hospitals typically perform drug testing in urine and alcohol testing in serum instead of whole blood. Serum has a different water content than whole blood, and we have to take this into account when we're interpreting those results. In this scenario, the plaintiff's urine tested positive for cannabinoids, and the defendant tested positive for alcohol. So literature helps us understand what impairment is expected at specific BACs for alcohol, and that's helpful for us to interpret the defendant driver's toxicology. But for the plaintiff, the urine cannabinoid finding for this driver needs to be investigated within the broader context of the case. Were there signs of impaired driving by the plaintiff? Were there any clinical signs or symptoms of cannabis intoxication that were noted by the EMS or in the ER records? When was the last time the plaintiff used marijuana? How did the plaintiff use marijuana? Because remember, with urine, we can't tie that to impairment, so we need to investigate that case a little bit further than just a urine result. Some types of questions that we typically answer for these types of cases could include, was someone alcohol impaired at the time of the crash? Was someone drug impaired at the time of the crash? So now let's discuss a fact pattern that I see quite a bit in child custody matters. In this case, the entire family was drug tested. The mom did not test positive for any drugs, while the dad tested positive for a marijuana metabolite. Remember, hair gives us an idea of drug use over weeks or months, not a specific day. So it's not something that we can necessarily tie to a parenting plan. Next, the child's urine tests were positive for the marijuana metabolite. Now, urine gives us an idea of what's been in someone's system. So in this case, the test for the child or the minor actually indicates that they had THC or marijuana circulating in their system and not just in their environment. In other cases, sometimes the judge will request hair testing for the child, and that can help us determine what they may have been exposed to in their home environment, not just in their bodies. Some of the types of questions that I try to answer for these types of cases could be to determine if the child has been exposed to drugs, to determine if the child has ingested or consumed drugs. We can also interpret the results of hair compared to urine, because remember, they give us different detection windows. Now, let's take a look at a workplace injury case. So here, the plaintiff was working and found unresponsive several minutes later. He was transported for his electrocution injuries. In this case, the hospital ran a drug screen in his urine, which is pretty typical. In many cases, urine is the most common type of sample that would be analyzed in both a hospital setting as well as workplace settings. So here we would need to review clinical signs and symptoms, witness reports, and prescription records to offer an interpretation of those results within the broader context of the case. So remember, urine does not give us any indication of impairment at the time of an incident. A typical question that I would answer for a case like this would be, was someone drug impaired at the time of the fall or injury incident? So thanks for walking through those drug categories with me, as well as some case examples. And I appreciate your attention this afternoon, or this morning if you're on the West Coast. A full biography for myself, as well as my curriculum vitae, is on my Robson page that I've got listed here. I've also got my email address. And after today's presentation, if you want to call and set up a free consultation with me for a future toxicology case, you can submit your information to our 800 number here, or inquiries@robsonforensic.com, so that they can run a conflict check before we have a discussion.